Shaquille O'Neal, a famous and very tall basketball player, walked into a fancy restaurant right in the middle of the city. The restaurant sparkled with light from giant, shiny chandeliers, and the people inside were dressed in their best clothes. Women wore beautiful gowns and men wore sharp suits. But Shaq wasn't dressed fancy at all. He wore a plain gray t-shirt, sweatpants, and some old sneakers that had seen better days. Even though the restaurant was known for being super elegant, Shaq didn't seem worried about what he was wearing. As soon as Shaq entered, many heads turned to look at him. Some people recognized him as the basketball legend who had played in the NBA. But others didn't seem to care who he was, they just thought he looked out of place. The diners whispered to each other, stealing glances as he calmly walked toward the front desk. At the reception desk stood Lila, a young waitress who always prided herself on keeping the restaurant classy. She was dressed neatly with her hair tied in a perfect bun. Lila loved working at the fanciest restaurant in the city and often thought of herself as the guardian of its elegance. But her pride made her quick to judge people, especially those she thought didn't fit in. When Lila saw Shaq, her smile faded, and she gave him a long, judgmental look. She scanned his simple clothes, and her eyebrows raised slightly as if to say, "You don't belong here." Shaq smiled politely and said in his deep, warm voice, "Good evening. I'd like to book a table if there's one available." Lila hesitated for a moment, not expecting him to speak so kindly. Then she smirked and replied in a tone dripping with sarcasm, "Are you sure you want to eat here? This is a fine dining restaurant." Her voice was loud enough for nearby diners to hear, and some turned their heads to see what was happening. Shaq didn't react to her tone. He simply nodded and said, "Yes, I'd like to try dining here." His calm voice made it clear he wasn't going to let her words bother him. Lila didn't hide her annoyance. She rolled her eyes and pretended to look for a table. "All right, let me find you a seat," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. She led Shaq past the fancy tables under the chandeliers and all the well-dressed people. Instead, she walked him to a small, dimly lit table in the far corner of the restaurant, right next to the kitchen. The table wasn't as nice as the others. It was noisy from the sound of dishes clinking and the faint smell of food drifting from the kitchen. Lila stopped there, turned to Shaq with a fake smile, and said, "This spot should match your style perfectly." She dropped the menu onto the table with a small thud, loud enough for nearby diners to notice. Shaq just smiled politely as if her rude comment didn't matter at all. He sat down and opened the menu, looking completely unbothered. This calmness seemed to frustrate Lila even more. At other tables, people started whispering. Some thought Lila was being mean for no reason. "She's so rude," a young woman said to her friend. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Others just watched quietly, curious to see what Shaq would do. Lila, still annoyed that Shaq wasn't reacting the way she wanted, decided to push further. She walked back to his table, holding the menu, and leaned in close. "Would you like me to explain the prices?" she asked in a sweet but mocking tone. She pointed to the most expensive dish on the menu and said, "The fanciest dish here is $350. Her voice made it clear she thought Shaq couldn't afford it. Shaq looked up at her, calm as ever, and said, "I'll have the filet mignon rossini." His tone was so steady and polite it almost sounded like he was ordering a regular burger. Lila was taken aback for a second but quickly recovered. She let out a laugh that sounded fake and said, "Oh really? I hope you know how to appreciate it. This isn't the kind of food everyone is used to." Nearby diners were now paying close attention. Some whispered to each other about how unfair Lila was being. "Why is she treating him like that?" someone said. A man at another table shook his head. "She thinks he can't pay because of how he's dressed," he muttered. Shaq, however, stayed calm and polite, making no attempt to argue or get upset. He simply smiled and said, "Thank you. I'm looking forward to trying it." His peaceful demeanor only seemed to irritate Lila more. As Lila walked away, she whispered to another waiter, Ryan, at the service counter. "Did you see that? He ordered the most expensive dish. He's probably just trying to show off. I bet he'll leave before the bill comes." Ryan, a kind-hearted young man, glanced at Shaq and then back at Lila. "Maybe he just wants to enjoy the food," he said quietly. Lila scoffed. "Look at him. Who comes to a place like this wearing sneakers like that? He's clearly out of his depth." Ryan didn't argue further, but he felt uneasy about the way Lila was acting. Meanwhile, Shaq continued to sit at his table, calmly looking through the menu and soaking in the restaurant's luxurious atmosphere. His peaceful presence caught the attention of an older couple sitting nearby. Mr. Harris, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair, watched the scene closely. He sipped his wine and said to his wife, "He's impressively composed." Most people would have gotten upset by now. Mrs. Harris nodded. There's something different about him, she said softly. The restaurant grew quieter, with an undercurrent of tension as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Shaq, however, seemed completely unfazed. He smiled at the waiters who passed by and even exchanged a polite nod with Mr. Harris. Lila, still watching Shaq from the service counter, felt a mix of frustration and satisfaction. She thought she had put him in his place by seating him in the corner and making sarcastic comments. But deep down, she was irritated that nothing seemed to bother him. Shaq, on the other hand, remained calm and collected, as if he was in no rush and had nothing to prove. His steady, peaceful energy started to shift the mood in the restaurant. People who had been whispering about him began to notice something special in the way he carried himself. Even though Lila had tried to embarrass him, Shaq's quiet confidence stood out more than anything else. It was clear to some of the diners, like Mr. Harris, that this man wasn't someone to be underestimated. As the tension in the room grew, everyone could feel that something big was about to happen. Shaq wasn't just there to eat, he was about to teach Lila and the whole restaurant a lesson they would never forget. Here's an expanded version of the rewritten story with more detail to meet the word count requirement. It maintains the simple and accessible language for a 7-year-old reader while elaborating on descriptions and character thoughts. Shaq caught her gaze and smiled warmly. His eyes seemed to say, "I'm fine, thank you." Across the room, Mrs. Harris leaned closer to her husband and whispered, "It's strange how they're treating him like that. Who do you think he is?" Mr. Harris put down his glass, his eyes still focused on Shaq. "There's something about him," he said softly. "That calmness, it's not something you see every day." On the other side of the restaurant, Lila, a waitress, kept talking to her co-worker Ryan. This time, her voice was loud enough for other diners to hear. "See? He didn't even make a reservation. People like him just want to sneak in and act like they belong. I bet he'll run out the second he sees the bill." A few people sitting at nearby tables heard Lila's words and gave her disapproving looks. In another corner of the room, a young woman named Sophie was having dinner with her friend. She frowned and turned to her companion. "She's being so rude," Sophie said, shaking her head. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Her friend, a calm man wearing glasses, nodded in agreement. "It's like just seeing him bothers her," he said. The restaurant, called La Lumière, was usually known for its peaceful atmosphere. Soft music played and the golden lights made everything feel cozy and warm. But tonight things felt different. Lila's loud remarks and the quiet whispers of the other diners mixed with Shaq's calm silence, creating a strange tension in the air. But Shaq didn't seem bothered. Even though he could tell people were judging him, he didn't feel like he had to explain himself. He sat there peacefully, his large hands resting lightly on the table, his eyes calmly watching the room. At the Harris's table, Mr. Harris let out a soft sigh, still looking at Shaq. "The world is strange," he said, his voice gentle but serious. "People forget that what really matters isn't what someone looks like or how they dress." Mrs. Harris nodded in agreement. But deep down, they both felt like this little drama wasn't over yet. Meanwhile, Lila decided she wasn't going to give Shaq the polite service the restaurant was known for. In her mind, he didn't deserve it. She grabbed her notebook and turned her back on him, pretending he didn't exist. She walked over to a fancy table in the middle of the room, where a wealthy couple was sipping red wine. Flashing her brightest smile, she leaned in and said sweetly, "Would you like another bottle of Margaux 2015? It's a perfect match for your meal." The couple smiled and nodded. Lila quickly wrote down their order and chatted with them, throwing in a few jokes to keep their attention. But even as she laughed and smiled, her eyes kept darting toward Shaq's table. Every time she passed his table, she pretended to be busy. She carried trays, chatted with other diners, and moved quickly, making it look like she hadn't noticed him. But anyone paying attention could see what she was doing. Shaq, who had faced tough challenges on the basketball court, didn't let it bother him. He stayed calm, his face peaceful. He glanced around the room, admiring the artwork on the walls and the sparkling chandelier above. In the corner of the restaurant, a jazz band played soft music. The gentle tunes made the room feel warm and inviting. When the song ended, Shaq clapped. His clapping was warm and kind, and the band members smiled at him, clearly appreciating the gesture. His clapping also caught the attention of some diners. They started whispering to each other, wondering, how can he stay so calm when he's being treated like this? At the counter, Lila frowned. The polite smile she gave other customers was gone. She was annoyed. Why doesn't he say anything? She thought. No complaints, no demands? She bit her lip in frustration. Lila decided to test his patience even more. She went to another table where new diners had just arrived. Instead of taking a quick order, she spent a long time explaining every single dish on the menu. She knew this would make Shaq wait even longer for his food. At the Harris's table, Mrs. Harris leaned closer to her husband and whispered, "Do you see what she's doing? She's being so mean to him on purpose. He's been waiting for at least 20 minutes. Mr. Harris took a sip of his wine, his sharp eyes watching Lila. "I see it," he said quietly. "But what's interesting is that he doesn't seem upset. He's waiting, but I think he's waiting for something more than just his meal." Shaq sat there calm as ever. He looked around the room, admiring the paintings and the chandelier. His peacefulness only made Lila more frustrated. She walked past his table again, speaking loudly to a coworker so Shaq could hear. "This is why we need higher standards," she said. "Some people just don't belong here. They try so hard to fit in, it's kind of funny." People at nearby tables heard her words. Some looked shocked. Others whispered to each other, clearly unhappy with Lila's behavior. Sophie, sitting nearby, couldn't stay quiet anymore. She leaned toward her friend and said, "She's awful. He hasn't done anything wrong and she's being so mean." Her friend nodded. "But look at him," he said. "He doesn't need anyone to stand up for him. He knows exactly what he's doing." Even though Lila kept ignoring Shaq, the room felt tense. Some people were quietly angry at Lila, but Shaq stayed calm as if nothing could bother him. Finally, after what felt like forever, Lila picked up a silver tray. On it was Shaq's order, a fancy $350 dish called filet mignon. She walked toward his table slowly, her high heels clicking loudly on the wooden floor. She wanted everyone in the room to notice her. When she got to Shaq's table, she placed the plate down with a loud clink. "Here's what you ordered," she said with a cold smile. "I hope you can appreciate it." Shaq looked at the dish and then up at Lila. He smiled warmly and said, "It looks delicious. Thank you." But Lila wasn't done. She leaned down a little, trying to look intimidating. In a low voice, she said, "This dish is for people who really know fine dining. Is this your first time having something like this?" Shaq looked up at her, his face calm. He smiled faintly and said, "Thank you for the advice." Shaq's calm reply surprised Lila. It made her feel a little unsettled. At a nearby table, Sophie leaned toward her friend and whispered angrily, "He just thanked her politely and she's still being rude. It's unbelievable." Her friend nodded, his eyes still on Shaq. "She's trying to make him upset, but she picked the wrong person. He's too calm to let her bother him." Lila straightened up and looked at Shaq again. She hoped he would show some kind of frustration or anger, but he didn't. He just sat there, smiling faintly as if nothing in the world could bother him. At the Harris's table, Mr. Harris watched closely. "She has no idea who she's dealing with," he said quietly. "A man like that doesn't need to say anything. She's embarrassing herself without even realizing it." Mrs. Harris nodded, her face showing how upset she felt about the situation. "I hope the manager steps in soon," she said. "This isn't fair to him, or to the rest of us. It's ruining the atmosphere of the restaurant." Sophie, watching from her table, couldn't believe what she was seeing. She shook her head and said to her friend, "How can she act like this in such a fancy restaurant? She's so unprofessional." Her friend nodded. "I think she's underestimating him. He doesn't need to fight back. She's already shown everyone who she really is." And so, the tension in the restaurant grew. Lila thought she was in control, but more and more diners were taking Shaq's side in their hearts. His silence and calmness said everything they needed to know. The once cozy atmosphere of La Lumiere had turned into something else. The restaurant felt like a stage with Lila and Shaq in the spotlight. But it wasn't Lila who was winning. Every action she took to embarrass Shaq only made her look smaller, while his quiet confidence shone brighter. Lila didn't realize it yet, but the whole room was watching. And they were waiting to see what would happen next. Lila gripped the notebook tightly in her hands, her face flushed with frustration. She turned quickly on her heel, walking back to the counter with brisk, sharp steps. She didn't glance back at the table she had just left. When she reached the counter, she slammed the silver tray down with a loud clang, startling her coworker, Ryan. He looked up, confused, his brows furrowing as he wiped a glass. "He's just pretending to be polite," Lila hissed, her voice shaking with anger. "I bet he doesn't even know what he ordered. People like that only come here for attention." Ryan stared at her, his expression calm but disapproving. "Lila, maybe he just wants to enjoy a peaceful dinner," he said softly. "Isn't it our job to serve everyone who walks in?" Lila spun to face him, her eyes blazing. "Can't you see, Ryan? He doesn't belong here. Look at him. And I bet as soon as he sees the bill, he'll walk out embarrassed. Meanwhile, at his table tucked in the corner of the fancy restaurant, Shaq sat quietly. His table was small and away from the spotlight, exactly the way he liked it. In front of him was a beautifully prepared dish, a tender filet mignon topped with a rich truffle sauce and paired with foie gras. The meal looked like a piece of art. Shaq took his time eating, savoring every bite. His movements were calm and graceful, and his face held a serene expression. Around him, other diners began to whisper to each other. "Why is she being so rude to him?" someone murmured. "She doesn't realize who that is," another replied, shaking their head. The air in the restaurant began to change. What was once a quiet, elegant atmosphere now felt heavy and uncomfortable. Some people stared at Shaq while others glanced at Lila, their faces showing quiet disapproval. Shaq, however, didn't seem bothered. He kept eating his meal as if nothing was happening. He was calm and composed, his actions quiet but steady. Lila, on the other hand, felt triumphant. She turned away from Shaq's table, a smirk tugging at her lips. She thought she had everything under control. In her mind, her slow service and cold attitude would eventually make the man leave humiliated. But Lila had no idea that her actions were leading her toward a moment she would never forget. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed across the room. From the front of the restaurant, Mr. Langston, the manager, appeared. He was a middle-aged man with a polished suit and a stern expression. His presence caught everyone's attention. He walked quickly toward Shaq's table, concern etched on his face. The diners nearby stopped talking, their curiosity growing. All eyes were now on the corner table where Shaq sat. When Mr. Langston reached the table, he gave a respectful bow. His voice was low and full of apology as he spoke. "Shaq, it's such an honor to have you here," Mr. Langston said. "I'm so sorry for the delay. We didn't know you were coming tonight." The words hit the room like thunder. A collective gasp spread among the diners. People looked at each other in shock, and whispers began to ripple through the restaurant. Did he just say Shaq? As in Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend? Someone at a nearby table asked, their eyes wide. Lila froze in place, the silver tray still in her hands. Her breath caught in her throat as her mind struggled to process what she had just heard. Shaq. Did he say Shaq? The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. At the surrounding tables, the whispers grew louder. "That's Shaquille O'Neal," a man murmured to his wife. "He's not just a basketball star. He owns businesses and helps so many people." Lila's heart pounded. Her face turned pale as she realized the entire room was now looking at her. Some diners glanced at her with judgment in their eyes, while others exchanged knowing looks. Mr. Langston turned his head, giving Lila a sharp look. His gaze was firm, his disappointment clear. Shaq, sitting calmly, placed his knife and fork down on the table. He picked up his glass of water and looked directly at Lila. His gaze wasn't angry, but it was serious, and it made Lila's knees feel weak. She wanted to disappear. "Miss Lila," Shaq said in a deep, steady voice. "What do you think about how customers should be treated?" Lila's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her voice felt stuck, her thoughts tangled. Finally she stammered, I didn't know who you were." Shaq shook his head gently. His expression softened, but his tone remained firm. "You don't need to know who I am to show me respect," he said. "Every person who walks through these doors deserves kindness and dignity." The room fell silent. Everyone listened to his words, and some diners nodded in agreement. Lila's face burned with shame. She lowered her head, clutching the tray in her trembling hands. The weight of her actions pressed heavily on her shoulders. Shaq continued, his voice calm but powerful. "Respect isn't just for people who look important or wear fancy clothes. It's something you give to everyone because they're human. That's the most basic thing we owe each other." Lila felt tears welling up in her eyes. She couldn't argue with him. Every word he said was true, and she knew it. From a central table, an older man whispered to his wife, "He doesn't need to yell. The way he speaks is enough to teach her a lesson." Nearby, a woman added, "She'll never forget this. I just hope she changes for the better." Mr. Langston stepped forward, breaking the silence. His tone was firm but not harsh. "Lila," he said, "we need to have a conversation after your shift. But for now, I'll handle this situation." Lila nodded faintly, her head bowed. She couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Slowly, she stepped back, trying to retreat from the scene. Shaq watched her for a moment, his gaze still steady but not unkind. Then he turned to Mr. Langston and said, "There's no need to make this a bigger issue than it is. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is whether they're willing to learn from them." His words weren't just for Lila. The whole room seemed to take them in, and a few diners lowered their heads, reflecting on their own behavior. Shaq stood up, his tall frame towering over the room. All eyes turned to him, the silence almost deafening. "This restaurant was built to welcome everyone," he said. His voice was calm but carried a strength that filled the room. "No matter who they are or where they come from, everyone deserves to feel valued here." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "The world has too much judgment," he said. "We judge people by how they look, how they talk, or what we think they have. But we can choose to be better. We can choose kindness and respect." He looked at Lila one last time. His expression wasn't angry, but it was firm. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is that we learn from them and do better." Lila felt tears roll down her cheeks. She nodded slowly, unable to speak. She knew she had been wrong, and she knew she needed to change. Shaq sat back down and resumed his meal. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual hum, but the atmosphere was different. Everyone seemed to carry Shaq's words in their hearts. Lila stood quietly in the corner, reflecting on everything that had happened. She knew this night would stay with her forever, a reminder of how important it was to treat everyone with kindness, no matter who they were. As the evening went on, Shaq finished his meal and left the restaurant. But the lesson he had taught lingered, not just for Lila but for everyone who had witnessed it. Shaq turned to face the entire team of staff. His voice was calm, but his eyes showed seriousness. "Lumiere is not just a restaurant," he said. "It's a place where we build friendships and treat each other with respect and care, no matter how people look or how much money they have. If we forget that, we don't just let ourselves down, we let down the people who trust us to be better." Some of the staff looked down, their faces filled with shame. Ryan, who had been quietly watching everything unfold, nodded slightly, his face reflecting a newfound respect for Shaq. Shaq turned his attention to the diners, and his voice grew stronger. "This isn't just about the staff. It's about all of us. We all have a responsibility to make this a good place. When you see someone being treated unfairly, you have the right, and I believe the responsibility, to speak up. Staying silent sometimes means you're letting it happen, and silence can be complicity." His words rippled through the room, touching every heart. Some diners bowed their heads, ashamed for having chosen silence in the face of what had happened. Others looked up at Shaq with newfound admiration. Sophie, one of the diners, couldn't contain herself and began clapping softly. Her applause was like a spark, and within seconds the entire room joined in. Mr. Harris, one of the diners, nodded in agreement and clapped too. A satisfied smile spread across his face. Shaq raised his hand gently, signaling for silence. He turned to Mr. Langston, who stood nearby, his expression a mix of worry and gratitude. "I believe we can do better," Shaq said, his voice calm yet resolute. "I'd like to meet with the entire staff after we close tonight. It's time for change." Mr. Langston nodded, his voice filled with respect. "Of course, Shaq. I'm sorry for what happened tonight. We'll make it right." Shaq sat back down and resumed his meal as if the powerful speech that had left the entire restaurant in thoughtful silence was nothing extraordinary. But it was clear that no one in the room would forget the lesson he had just delivered. In the corner, Lila felt the weight of shame pressing on her shoulders. Yet beneath the embarrassment, a new determination began to take root, a resolve to change, to become better, not just for her job but for herself. When the last diners left the restaurant, Lumiere sank into a rare quiet. The staff gathered in the main space, forming a circle around Shaq, who stood at the center with a calm yet commanding presence. The light from the chandelier above reflected on his face, highlighting the seriousness and sincerity in his gaze. Shaq scanned the group, his eyes moving from Mr. Langston, the restaurant manager, to each member of the staff, including Lila, who stood at the edge of the circle, her head bowed as though trying to avoid his gaze. His voice was deep and steady, each word carrying weight. "Everyone makes mistakes," he began. "But what matters is what we learn from them. Mistakes don't define us. How we correct them does." He paused, letting his words sink in. A few staff members nodded slightly, as if recognizing that his words weren't just meant for Lila, but for everyone in the team. Shaq continued, his eyes sweeping across the room. "This restaurant isn't just a place to eat. It's a space where people come to experience something special, to feel valued. Our responsibility is to ensure that anyone who walks through those doors feels welcomed, regardless of how they dress, how they speak, or how much money they have in their wallet." Lila, standing at the far end of the circle, felt as though his words struck her directly in the heart. Her eyes began to glisten and she bit her lip, struggling to keep herself from breaking down. But she knew she couldn't avoid this forever. Shaq's gaze finally settled on Lila. There was no anger, no disdain, only sternness tempered with trust. "Lila," he called softly but firmly. "Today has been a tough day, not just for you but for everyone here. I want to hear from you. What do you think we should do to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Lila looked up, her eyes red and watery. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room awaiting her response. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I'm sorry, Shah. I was wrong. I let my own biases blind me and I failed in my responsibilities. I truly regret it." She took another deeper breath, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't realize that respect isn't about how someone looks. I understand that now and I promise I'll change." Shah nodded slightly, his eyes reflecting a mixture of gentleness and encouragement. "That change is for you, Lila, not for me or anyone else. Change is a process and I believe you can do it if you truly want to." His words weren't just for Lila. They resonated with everyone in the room. A few staff members nodded subtly, acknowledging that they too needed to rethink their perspectives and actions. Shah stepped forward into the center of the circle, his voice dropping lower but growing even more resolute. "This restaurant isn't defined by fancy tables or expensive dishes. It's defined by people, by how we treat each other and our guests. And if we don't do that with respect and compassion, nothing else matters." The room fell silent, only the soft sound of breathing filling the space. Mr. Langston, standing beside Shah, spoke up. His voice was full of gratitude. "Shah, thank you for your words. We will make sure our team not only learns from this mistake but truly changes, so that Lumiere becomes a place where everyone feels welcome." Shah nodded, his eyes showing a hint of relief. He looked around the room one last time before concluding, "Now is the time to start fresh, stronger and better. I believe you all can do it." Lila wiped her tears, feeling as though a heavy burden had been lifted. But she also felt like she had been given a new opportunity to make things right. In Shah's gaze she saw no resentment, only a glimmer of hope. And that made her even more determined to change. That night, as everyone left the restaurant, not only Lila but the entire team at Lumiere understood that this wasn't just a lesson for their work. It was a profound lesson about how to be better human beings. The glass door of Lumiere gently closed behind Shah, and the elegant space dimmed. The lights of Beverly Hills stretched out beyond, illuminating his tall figure as he walked down the sidewalk. The stillness of the late night enveloped the surroundings, broken only by the faint rustling of trees and the distant hum of passing cars. Shah walked slowly, his eyes fixed on the street ahead, while his mind lingered on the events that had just unfolded. He thought about the restaurant, about Lila, the staff, and the diners who had witnessed tonight's moment. It wasn't just a lesson for one person. It was a lesson for everyone, including himself. He took a deep breath and let his lips curl into a faint smile. A thought echoed in his mind, powerful and clear, just like the words he had spoken during the meeting earlier. The world needs more kindness. True strength isn't in judgment but in acceptance. And it's the small daily choices that define who we are. Shah remembered his time on the basketball court, facing criticism, unfair judgments made about him because of his playing style. He recalled how patience and calmness had helped him rise above it all. And tonight he saw a similar moment, not on a court but in a restaurant. As Shah rounded a corner, the glow of a neon sign reflected off his face, accentuating his confident and composed demeanor. He knew that his actions tonight weren't about showcasing power or proving anything. They were about planting seeds for change, not just within Lumiere but in the way people treat each other in the wider world. He paused for a moment, turning to look back at Lumiere, now dimly lit through its windows. He hoped that tonight's events wouldn't just fade into obscurity but would remain a lasting lesson for Lila, the staff, and the diners who had witnessed it. Kindness, Shah thought, isn't about grand gestures. It's about small, consistent choices made every day. When you choose to treat someone well, you don't just change them, you change yourself. Shah kept walking, leaving the bright lights of Beverly Hills behind. The road ahead stretched endlessly, just like the message he had imparted tonight. Lumiere was no longer just a restaurant. It had become a symbol of hope, change, and the power of healing through the smallest acts of kindness. The story of Lumiere wasn't just about a dinner, it was a profound lesson in respect and compassion, two values that should never be constrained by appearances or status. Shaquille O'Neal showed us that sometimes calmness and kindness can be the most powerful tools to challenge and change what seems unchangeable. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories. I'll see you in the next video.